Hello and a very warm welcome to Insight. I am Amandra Bhatt. India's economic growth is projected to surpass that of China's in 2016, with the GDP expected to zoom by 7.7%. This according to a UN report which said that India will help accelerate growth in South Asia. The mid-year update of the UN World Economic Situation and Prospects, which was released yesterday, said India's economy is projected to grow by 7.6% this year and 7.7% in 2016, overtaking China. China is projected to grow by 7% in 2015 and 6.8% next year. The report termed South Asia's economic outlook as largely favorable, since most economies are expected to experience a strengthening of growth in 2015-16 on the back of stronger domestic consumption and investment and a pickup in exports. In the course of next 60 minutes or so, we discuss what is the outlook for India's economic growth and what are the challenges that lie ahead. And to discuss the same, we are joined in our studios a distinguished panel of guests. Please welcome Professor Yamini Agarwal. She's a professor in the Indian Institute of Finance. Welcome to Insight, Professor Agarwal. Sitting next to her is Dr. P. Pula Rao. He's the president of the Forum of Social and Economic Rights. He's also a well-known economist. Welcome to the show, Dr. Pula Rao. We are also joined by Ashok Das Gupta. He's a senior business journalist. Welcome to Insight, Mr. Das Gupta. And later in the program, we'll be joined by Sunil Sinha of India Ratings and Research. Dr. Agarwal, I'd like to begin the discussion with you. So 7.6% this year and 7.7% in 2016, so says the United Nations in its report. We are all set to overtake China. And this comes soon after Moody's upgraded our economic outlook towards positive. How do you view these developments?
I think it's a very good development. Internationally, we have been able to prove that we would be one of the contributing countries in the world growth, and the entire world is looking at developing Asia for bringing about more growth and development, and especially for India, which is looking in for more international acceptance, both in terms of let's say its development as well as in terms of its stature as an economic power. I think United Nations, this report brings it parallel to what China stands, as well as to many other emerging economies which are trying to find a place for themselves. So it's a very good development on part of let's say India's growth story.
Dr. Pula Rao, but what would be the factors that would contribute to this economic growth?
I only have to quote what the UN report itself said. It said the economy was weak in the first quarter of 2014, but picked up in the second quarter and later on, thanks to the changes brought by the government. They have explicitly, I mean, it's so well timed on this first anniversary for whatever purposes, that they say that some of the changes, economic changes brought about by the new government has led to this. You know, the FDI, the recognition that bureaucracy has to be changed and various other restrictions have to be done. It has led to more investment on the country, better business sentiment. So according to the UN report, and I would say that the UN report, you know, is kind of mother of all reports, in the sense it would take into consideration all these large banks, large think tanks around the world, the World Bank, IMF, and with that kind of knowledge, they probably produce a report touching every sector. And in the section on South Asia, they dwelt a lot on the emerging situation in India. I'd also say that Pakistan and Iran also are looking up, but China is slightly slowing down because of its infrastructure worries, excessive investment and other things. So they still say that the situation is very good, but there could be some unforeseen circumstances. But right now, the trajectory of growth for India is kind of assured according to them. That is a very encouraging sign that some of these policies are bearing fruit or may bear fruit because of their own predictions of rate growth. As you know, many of these, in some discussions here, there has been, sometimes we talked about whether our own figures were correct or not. You know, there's kind of a discussion on
the new methodology.
New methodologies. But obviously we can take the United Nations to have had considerably better research or better, talent maybe or whatever, and they have come to this conclusion. So
Okay.
perhaps this is the basis of that.
Okay, but Mr. Das Gupta, of course, as Dr. Pulla Rao said, and the report also credits the structural reforms that have gained momentum since the new government took charge in May 2014, and so on, and also the reform process which has been fast-tracked. There are also global factors contributing to these figures, and I'm talking about the fall in international oil prices.
Yeah, sure. I mean, that was a windfall, so to say. Remember that along with the fall in crude oil prices, which was nearly half of the high that we have seen earlier, there has been a fall in commodity prices also, global commodity prices. Now, as far as India is concerned, the crude oil prices getting half of what it was earlier was a windfall, both for conservation of foreign exchange reserves and therefore much lower within target current account deficit and all that. But that was something which was, I would say, more of an aberration, because now you find currently oil prices are inching up.
Right.
Now, one doesn't expect oil prices to reach the earlier high levels of $110 per barrel, but definitely they could, over a period, touch about $70 to $80 a barrel, and the government has said that the country is comfortable with that range, which means that if, God forbid, it goes higher, then our economic calculations will go all right. Now, that's a big question mark there.
Okay.
Now, when you talk about, I mean, the very point of discussion that the UN report has said that will grow at a faster clip than China, I would say for every Indian that is something to be very pleased about, but nothing beyond that.
Okay.
For the simple reason that, you know, the Chinese liberalization process started about more than 2 decades ago. We started in 1991, so there is a gap of 20 years.
Okay.
If you go by the various economic parameters, China is about 5 to even 8 times more than what India is.
Right.
Now, we are saying, the UN report has said that we'll grow at a faster pace, definitely, because we have not grown. We had the Hindu rate of growth earlier. We crossed that. We came to a respectable level of growth. But remember that China grew at over 10%, double digit, for at least 20 years.
Okay.
And which is why China is where it is.
Okay.
Now, we need to grow at that clip
Okay.
if we want to remove poverty from the country.
Okay.
And that growth, with the reforms that are taking place and are in the pipeline, will probably help us achieve that.
All right.
The other thing is, you know, statistical percentage terms doesn't mean much except for the percentage and the figure,
Okay.
because we have the benefit of a low base effect also,
Right.
right? Just like in inflation, you know, you have negative inflation because you had a much higher rate earlier.
Okay.
So comparatively it is negative. You get my point? So all these differences are there. We should be very happy that UN report has projected that given the potential and the reforms that are taking place, we should grow at a faster pace than China.
Okay.
But then it has to be consistent, sustainable,
Okay.
and we should continue for 15-20 years with that growth rate.
All right. Dr. Agarwal, what would you say to what Mr. Das Gupta just said, that these are just numbers, and what do they mean on the ground when they are translated into actual terms, and is this growth sustainable? Because China is where it is right now because it's been growing at double-digit rate for 2 decades now.
Actually, for last 3 decades, China has been registering a 10% growth rate, and it is only in this decade that it has seen a slowdown, primarily because there is a world recession all around. You see the US economy, you see the UK economy, you see the Eurozone. There are situations where there is a Eurozone crisis. You see a situation where there is a very high unemployment rate in US of about 6%. You see you hardly see much of a growth rate. You're talking about accommodative monetary policies on the end of the Euro countries, on the end of the US, even at other places. The only place where you see much of a growth is coming from the developing Asia, which includes India and China. Now, as far as India is concerned, India has been banking on its growth rate from its consumption, which is its domestic consumption largely, from investments which come from the industry, and from the government expenditure. Government expenditure has largely been curtailed on the account of the FRBM, which is the Fiscal Responsibility Management Act. However, investments and consumptions continue to be high because we are a large domestic economy. As far as China is concerned, it has been banking on a lot of its growth primarily because of the external sector, which is a high manufacturing base of economies of scale, which has developed for exporting a large amount of its manufactured goods to the world over economies. Lately, just because it has seen a slower growth rate, China has now tried to move from an industrial growth rate to a services growth rate, which India always had. India, if you look at its growth story from liberalization point of view, we have been unable to create a manufacturing base for ourselves. We have been unable to create a name for ourselves where our products may be equated with those of the other economies, let's say of the Japanese economy or the German economy, where we have a made in India brand much popular than any other brand. China, on the other hand, despite the fact it does not have that great quality in terms of the products it is saying, but because of the economies of scale and because of the lower cost, it has been able to flood large number of markets in the world. India has been trying to transcend from the services economy to the manufacturing economy, but has not been able to give sufficient incentive to the India has been able to do. So when we look at these two economies, first of all, they're not competitive at all. They're largely complementary, where China is largely a manufacturing base, we are a services industry. Second of all, the present foreign policy also accommodates for a position where we are looking at neighbors trying to help each other.
Right.
So we do see this growth story going much forward, where all of them would work in more complementary positions rather than as competitors to each other.
All right. On that note, it's time for us to slip into a short break in the program. Stay with us. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Insight. We are talking about India's economic growth outlook. And right now on the program, we are joined by Sunil Sinha in our studios, Director of India Ratings and Research. Welcome to the show. Mr. Sinha, we were discussing the United Nations World Economic Situation and Prospects report, which says that our economic growth is projected to surpass that of China's. They are predicting a growth rate of 7.7% in 2016 and 7.6% this year. What do you think of these numbers?
Well, our own, India Ratings projection for fiscal year 16 is 7.7%. And if I compare this number with FY15, then FY15 number was 7.4%. So in that sense, definitely the growth is going to be somewhat better than FY15. But in my own view, the overall situation is that the growth, even for FY17, FY18, given the context, given the macro situation, both domestic as well as global, the overall growth is likely to be gradual, nothing dramatic.
And what about China's growth rate? They are projected to grow by 7% this year, 6.8% next year. But as Mr. Dasgupta pointed out earlier in the program, China stands where it is because it's been growing at a much higher rate for the last 2 decades or so.
Well, that's certainly one of the issue that China has grown very rapidly over the last 2 decades. For a number of years, they had double-digit growth. So obviously the base is very high. So on a high base, to sustain a double-digit growth is certainly not very easy. But the crucial issue before China is that China's model had been an export-led economy. So as the overall situation elsewhere in the world is not picking up. I mean, in fact, if you look at our own exports, I mean, India's exports are not doing well. And one of the reason for that is that the demand in the advanced economy is quite tapered. So, I mean, in an export-led model, obviously China is now witnessing the adverse impact of depending too much on exports and much less on the domestic demand. So China at this juncture at a policy level is also trying to recalibrate. So they are in a way trying to shift their focus, and they are concentrating on generating more domestic demand as compared to the external demand, because it's unlikely that the external demand is going to be of the similar order as it was before the global financial crisis.
Dr. Pula Rao, you wanted to come in here?
I would like to say that China recalibrating, you see, there was huge growth because of the Olympics also. The Chinese Olympics was credited with, the vast infrastructure development for about 10 years. So that has gone off. But there also seem to be, the discussion is only whether India is happy we have a higher rate of growth than China, then that happiness will not last long. Because Chinese are consolidating. Their new government, they're giving a lot of emphasis on governance. They're removing all their inefficiencies in a very ruthless way. The railways have seen a lot of change in managements, their infrastructures, their banks, their army. The new government there is definitely focusing on governance as one of the ways to consolidate its gains, avoid wastage, avoid lopsided development. So I would feel that since we also depend on oil as one of our, main foundations, how our economy works, China also depends, and they're also recalibrating their whole setup. But the other aspect of this report, the UN report, which is just not a think tank offering its expertise for sale, it says the UN's objective is that there should be greater coordination between macroeconomic policies of various countries, so that those areas like South America, which are going back, or the Middle East, which are not doing well, they should change their policies. And other countries also should be aware that each one is interdependent, that you can't have high growth and comfort in one place, and it will not. One of the objectives of this report, it would seem to me, is that the UN also had certain millennium goals, and now its objective, it says we want sustained economic development. Covering everything, environment, population, social indicators. So it does look to have some give and take suggestions on which countries should do well, pointing out, for example, that Japan is really failing because the high consumer, the taxes are so high, the latest consumption tax is so high that consumer demand has gone down. It has pointed out pitfalls which India should avoid, and also shown that some things we are doing well.
And a quick word on the impact of the base effect that Mr. Dasgupta mentioned earlier.
No, the base effect is there, but the feel-good factor also is there. Mr. Dasgupta has said this may not be a great thing in the long run. But when Indians read that their economy is going to do a little faster, better than China, the common man feels maybe we are on the right track. There's a buoyancy in sentiment also, and perhaps encourages the governments also, all the state governments, central government, and the government to act together to push forward, keeping in mind, of course, that internationally there are two other things pointed out. I take a little liberty with our panel here. Secular stagnation, which will affect India, because the Europe, as Professor Agarwal has pointed out, Europe and America are not doing well, and also they also talk about sovereign wealth funds, which some countries have, which are able to balance their economies in good and bad days. There are a number of countries, the report says, they have sovereign wealth funds, which we don't have. So there are some things maybe India should consider.
Okay, we've also seen considerable progress on the prices front. Dr. Agarwal, inflation numbers have come down. To what extent do you think this has contributed to the overall economic outlook?
See, macroeconomic aggregates, we need price stability to actually ensure that people have capacity to buy. And that price stability is ensured through large number of external factors as well as internal factors. When we talk about external factors, we do understand that there are lower prices on oil and there are low prices of other commodities which we are importing. When we talk about, let's say, internal factors, there has been observed growth rate in India, and there is development observed overall. Again, inflation rate is about 5% or 6%, as we may know, which is kind of considered to be good for all developing countries, largely, to act upon. However, unfortunately, what it has led to is it has led to a lower interest rates in our economy, which has led to a lower deposit rates in our economy, leaving banks with lesser number of deposits. Giving though some amount of a stance to the government to actually bring about government expenditure, to bring about easing monetary policies so that there is money supply with people and there is more consumption in the economy. And if that works out, there is likely to be more development. Again, we need to look at two more important aspects in our economy, which is again the production, meeting out the supplies, demand requirements that are there, and the employment factor. Employment is an important factor. Though this government has maintained the Manrega scheme, it is planning to take care of the common man. It is planning to take care of the unemployed youth. It has started a large number of educational opportunities for different people to be employed. However, a lot of industrial development is not being observed, whereby setting up new industrial units, which may guarantee new employment opportunities, guarantee new growth. Make in India is a very good initiative. However, it has not been put much in force. Developments from foreign sector in terms of FDI, portfolio flows are also good developments, but they have not shown much of a growth to the economy. India remains to be a good investment avenue because of its neutral and secular structure. I may call it secular primarily because if you look at the foreign policy today, we have been able to extend a hand of friendship to Pakistan, to China, to other people. And the Prime Minister has been able to also balance with the Western world as well as with its neighbors. So as a matter of fact, there is a certain amount of neutral, secular outlook which has been created for India overall. Well, if we want development through, we need to improve upon domestic consumption, and monetary developments are also necessary for that.
Jobs is an important factor here, Mr. Dasgupta. As Dr. Agarwal mentioned, the UN report also points this out as one of the challenges for our economic growth. We have to address the labor market rigidness and, of course, creating job for the millions of new entrants into the job market.
Absolutely. A lot of challenges ahead as far as the job market is concerned, as far as labor reforms is concerned. You see, the main problem that corporates feel, companies feel, is that the ease of doing business is an irritant. We need to do a lot of work on that front. But once you have set up shop, if things go bad, it becomes very difficult to exit. Now that's a major stumbling block. The work has to be, policy work has to be done on that front. Now, the Make in India campaign, what does the Prime Minister want? He wants big companies, both domestic as well as mainly foreign investors, to come in and set up manufacturing hubs here to export it from here to the rest of the world. Now that again, although it's a very promising, I would say, campaign that has been started, there is a lot of work that needs to be on that front. First, let me explain. Right now, China is a sort of manufacturer to the entire world. From Alaska to Sydney, you have those $1 stores where umpteen Chinese products are being sold at a throwaway price. Now, India cannot afford to do that. Simply put, there are a lot of companies who are getting things manufactured in China and putting their trademark label here, because possibly of cheaper wages and mainly economies of scale. They have such huge capacities that they can service the entire world as far as low and medium end technology is concerned. Now that also creates jobs. But for those jobs, you need skill development. Now, we have a situation here, we were always good in services. China was good in manufacturing, is good in manufacturing. Now, what has made China change tack? The simple reason is the meltdown which is why their export market got squeezed.
Right.
And now they're looking at domestic consumption. Now, an average Chinese does not tend to spend. He has a savings rate of something like 40 to 45%. Spend. The second thing is that because of the way China has developed its infrastructure, the way we develop, we set up a township, the roads, electricity, etc. come later. Before that, people have come into those residential localities. China works differently. If you, from the airport, both Shanghai and Beijing, you're going down the expressway, you'll find huge townships. Not a soul there, deserted, but all the infrastructure is in place. Now, that helped China, that infrastructure development helped China maintain its growth.
All right.
But now what it has led to is a sort of housing bubble. And this is what China wants to now deflate.
Okay.
Which is why the growth rate, they have planned it to come down a bit.
All right.
So that it comes on an
Okay,
even
Mr.
keel.
Das Gupta, I'll come back to you in just a moment. We have to slip into a short break here. Stay with us. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Insight. We are discussing India's economic growth outlook. Mr. Das Gupta, please continue. I interrupted you before the break.
Yeah. You see, so what I was saying is, that is the situation as far as the two countries are concerned. Now, as I said earlier, jobs you will get in large numbers, the numbers that are needed for the country because of the people who are coming out from colleges, graduates, etc. But skill development is the main thing as far as manufacturing is concerned.
Right.
Which is why the government, and which is very good, but I don't know how much action is actually happening there.
Okay.
Skill development has to be done so that they are employable.
All right.
Once that is there, then you will have manufacturing capacity as well as jobs. But then if you're talking about the government is thinking, in his foreign visits, he goes and talks about make in India, that come to India, make in India, etc. What is needed? Infrastructure.
Absolutely.
Power is the main thing. Now, the country as a whole, we are power deficient. So one has to ensure that adequate power is there.
Right.
The second is land for setting up manufacturing capacities, facilities. We have a situation where our land acquisition bill is still stuck. One doesn't know when it will get approved. Then the ease of doing business is there. The FDI regulations, on which again a lot of work has been done. But then remember that China is already a manufacturing hub for the rest of the world.
Okay.
There are a lot of MNCs who have set up shop. The iPad you buy, the laptop you buy is all made in China.
Right.
For them to switch over to come to India and manufacture, you need to make India much more attractive.
Okay. All
Now
right.
we have certain plus points. As far as governance is concerned, we are much more on the positive side as people look at it than China.
Okay.
Right? But we need to do work on a lot of other infrastructure fronts.
All right.
We have a country where we have 250 million English-speaking population. China has about 10 million. But remember that China knows that this is a disadvantage for them, and they are having coaching classes
Right.
for not only their skilled workers, they are now starting from school.
Right, they're
the
working on
children,
it.
they have speak English classes. So they're working at a plan.
Okay.
Now to compete, for the two countries to compete that way in the manufacturing sector will be, I see, is a huge challenge.
All right. Dr. Pulara wants to come in here.
One of the policies of the government is not essentially to come here, make and export from India. It is like signaling the Chinese government that we have such a huge import gap with you. Why don't, what you are exporting to us, why don't you make it in India? You know, so that we have, you're anyway selling it to us. Why manufacture in China? You manufacture some of that here. The same thing, for example, defense purchases also. It's not that India will become an export hub for defense purchases. That we are buying. You make something here. You subcontract something here. That's one of the conditionalities, you know, written or unwritten, that is obviously being imposed. So make in India doesn't just necessarily mean you come here to make.
I didn't mean just the relations with China. The entire world.
You can, what you are importing, a huge import gap, especially with China.
Right.
You can do that. And the other thing also, the land bill, as I see, we already have a land bill for where the land bill is to be amended is for private needs, not for public needs. Public needs, there's going to be no change. They can just acquire the land for irrigation projects, for roads. That was there in the last bill also. There's no stopping public acquisitions. And so perhaps, just I wanted to take forward what he has said. And, you know, the rest of the situation is you need to have the other reforms to keep it up. And one more point is, the oil price, according to all predictions, is going to be stable for another year at least. So that kind of inputs for India may be stable. You know, the oil may not be a factor unless there's some conflagration somewhere.
But there are tensions going on.
No, there are tensions. But you see, everybody talks about now shale oil is close, there's no production gap. But technology and methodologies have been improved in the last year, whereby shale oil, for example, America is producing 8 million barrels of oil a day. They can switch back whenever they want because the cost and economies, new technologies have now made it viable to make $45, $50 a barrel also. Shale oil can be economical. And interestingly enough, all predictions show that oil supply is more than the rate of growth.
I'll come back to that point. But Mr. Sinha, the point that we were discussing earlier, Make in India, the government's dream of transforming India into a global manufacturing hub. Do we have the requisite infrastructure in place, the skills that are needed, access to finance and so on? Because these are the issues that need to be worked on.
Well, I mean, when one looks at the whole campaign of Make in India, I mean, it's certainly a positive move so far as, I mean, if one looks at the structure of the economy, certainly, and if you look at the number of people which are dependent on agriculture, and if you have to remove them from agriculture and gainfully employ in the, manufacturing or industrial sector, then certainly this is a step forward. However, there are a number of constraints also. See, when we talk of ease of doing business, one of the biggest challenge for improving the ease of doing business doesn't rest with the central government or the union government. It actually rests with the state government. Mr. Modi, as a chief minister, was able to do a lot because he was the CM and he was the executioner. As a PM, he is not going to be the executioner, he is going to be the policy maker. The execution would still have to happen at the state level. So if you really want to improve the ease of doing business in the Indian context, then the focus has to be on the state government and state-related issues. I mean, say for example, even land acquisition. Central government is trying to create a policy framework, but ultimately the land acquisition, whether it will happen, not happen, or whatever are the impediments, etc., all of that has to be decided at the state level. Apart from that, there are other issues which relates to the local government. I mean, you set up a business, you need a power connection, you need a sewerage connection, all of that falls in the domain of the local government. So there are these issues. So, I mean, you will be able to really make in India happen only if one looks at the whole issues across the board. Just looking at one end and ignoring the other end will not lead you anywhere. And
this has talking about cooperative federalism also,
so in that sense, obviously, I think more than the economic, it is a political challenge for the government to really bring the states on board so that their thought process is not different from the thought process of the union government.
All right.
I mean, so long as that does not happen, you may say n number of things, but you will, on the ground, you will not be able to really improve upon the ease of doing business.
Okay. And, Dr. Agarwal, how big a challenge is this going to be?
I think it's going to be a big challenge, but the 14th Finance Commission has already accommodated for giving more money to the states for bringing about development, as well as they have included they thought about the new tax reforms which are to be introduced, which is likely to make things a little more easier. Also, a lot of infrastructural development projects which were stuck because of the land acquisition not taking place is likely to be given away, primarily because the land acquisition bill has been passed, at least at the Lok Sabha, if not at the Rajya Sabha. And I don't think there should be too much of a difficulty, because the similar bill was placed by the previous government in 2013, and Rajya Sabha has a majority from the previous government itself. So when we look at infrastructure development, projects which are stuck, which rightly mentioned as electricity, roads, railways, freight corridors or others, they are likely to receive, let's say, away because of this land acquisition bill, also because of the large number of other reforms which are there, which may include, let's say, the judicial reforms that are there, let's say the tax reforms that are there, and the other reforms which this government has been taking an initiative towards. So there is a progress that is likely to be there, and infrastructure by including public-private partnerships, the PPP program which is there, is likely to get some amount of boost, I believe.
Dr. Pullaramam?
What just Dr. Sinha has said, that the states have to carry forward these these activities, make in India, make the business, ease of doing business is actually the states has to implement them. I agree, and I think states in India have also become very competitive now. They're trying to get industries, they're trying to make it smooth. A little recent example, Google, for example, has decided to set up its third largest office in the world in India after Silicon Valley, London, and Hyderabad. And there has been a lot of competitive bidding in the last 6 months, delegations went there. And states, I think, are more alert now than that. We want industry, there is that competitive, political competitiveness, governance issues are there.
Even in the area of smart cities, we are seeing this.
Now, every give you some school uniforms or midday meals. They want higher wages. They're aspirational. The aspirational society in India is wide. And state governments are there now. And I think they're very, very efficient. Taking off from what Mr. Modi had done in Gujarat or other people have done in other states. So that kind of paraphernalia, that kind of ecosystem is there now in India to absorb some of the ideas of the central government, whatever political opposition they may have externally and all that. There is a lot of accommodation going on inside, thanks to the additional funds which are coming to the states, 42% if I am not wrong. And therefore that there is something going on in tandem. How long it goes on, how long external environment remains smooth, that there is no war, there is no tension, and there is no, various factors. And you can't have it forever. But if you have it for 4 or 5 years, maybe you build up enough infrastructure, maybe you build other things so that you have a base to take off.
All right. Well, with that, it's time for us to slip into yet another break here. Stay with us. We'll be back with the final segment of the show. Welcome back to Insight. We are talking about India's economic growth outlook in the light of the latest United Nations report on world economic situation. Mr. Sinha, I believe you wanted to add something to what we were discussing before the break.
Yeah, I mean, the whole issue relating to the state government is not simply a function of what 14th Finance Commission has given to them, and in aggregate terms they will be getting the same amount of money which the earlier commission had recommended. However, the difference is that this time the untied portion is going to be much larger as compared to the earlier commission. So in that sense, the state governments will have more freedom to use the money which they get from the center for the purpose for which they want to spend. So to that extent, they can tailor-make it according to the need and requirement of the state. So to that extent, it is certainly a very positive development. However, one has to also see that there have been number of states, a number of instances in the Indian context, where a huge amount of funds have been made available from the center to the state, but the center does not have the capacity to spend them.
Okay.
So again, even with the 14th Finance Commission higher devolution of untied grants, the real challenge again is at the state level, that you have the money, but do you have the vision, do you have the capacity, do you have the machinery to spend it in a way that it really works for the state, really leads to higher development, betterment of the state, and so on and so forth. And if one looks at across the states, there are certain states where the capacity is there, and unfortunately these are also the ones which are already developed, and the ones which are not developed, they don't have the internal capacity to really use these funds the way they should have. So I think at this juncture it is equally important, apart from other measures, that the capacity building at the state level should happen, so that
they are
able to not only absorb but take the overall agenda forward. And here, in my view, the role of the Niti Aayog is going to be absolutely critical. But we will have to see as to how things really unfold in over the next maybe 3 to 4 years.
That's something that remains to be seen. Mr. Das Gupta, now the UN report also says that food prices could be pushed up by certain structural factors in the country. Our agricultural output, you know, is mainly dependent on the monsoons, and weather conditions have not been too favorable in the past, and a deficient monsoon has been predicted. What do you think is going to be that's going to be another major challenge in the days to come?
Absolutely. You see, we have had already unseasonal rains, which has impacted crops and the farmers' funds. Now, that again, it's a sort of chain. If the farmers have less money in their pockets, then the rural growth that was expected will not be there.
Right.
And the corporates are aware of it. Now we have the monsoon. How does the monsoon behave? El Nino effect and all that. The earlier forecast was very bad. The next forecast that came, that the rains, it will hit Kerala by the appointed date, all that is very positive. Provided we have a good monsoon which leads to a good crop, prices will remain stable. Otherwise, if the monsoons are deficient, then you will find food prices spiking up. Even now, although we have a low inflation level, the main component is food inflation, which is on the higher side. Now, that will be a huge negative as far as our growth prospects are concerned. But coming back to our main topic, the government is absolutely on the right track. It is proceeding step by step. Make in India, as we all discussed, is a very good campaign. But there are major challenges that need to be looked at. The other problem that is cropping up in recent times is political. You see, when we talk about ease of doing business, it means a lot of policy reforms. And those reforms are being seen in political circles as pro-corporate, as opposed to anti-farmer. Now, if the nation has to develop as a whole, then all these political sort of chicanery should not be there. You see, take a simple example. We are stuck with the GST bill and recently the land acquisition bill. Now, as Professor Pullarao pointed out, there is no problem in public land acquisition. Obviously, it was never there. If manufacturing capacity is to be set up, it will be private companies that come in. Public sector units will not be leading the way. They will be leading, public sector will be leading as far as public investment in infrastructure is concerned. not manufacturing capacities per se.
Okay.
Now that is what. The GST bill, had it been in China, would have been implemented 5-6 years back. Same with land acquisition bill. But is that the type of development that the countrymen need? Everybody would say, no, we do not want that sort of a development. But as far as overall growth of the country's economy is concerned, I think measures should not be politicized.
Okay.
The way things are happening now, I have a fear that the pace at which the government was moving ahead, it may tend to, slow up a bit.
Okay.
And that would be very wrong.
Okay. Dr. Pulla Rao, you
Well,
want to add
by
something?
and large, we don't have that kind of political gridlock which we are seeing in the UK and USA, far more advanced countries, or even France. By and large, though there is a lot of political antagonism, they do compromise. We have standing committees, consultative committees, they come up, a lot of laws were passed. But as Das Gupta ji has said, yes, there are two highly visible measures which are stuck, which should go fast. But I also take the view in a democracy, this kind of give and take has to take place.
All right.
You can't say, I introduced this bill, so you accept it. This kind of give and take takes place, and it is good. Of course, it should not be forever and all that. The discussion should take place, and Indian parliamentary system or democracy has always been accommodative. We find that they have passed laws which are necessary, they have carried on. In fact, 2013, all these political parties passed the same land acquisition bill. All these political parties together passed so many bills together, and this kind of thing shows the health of our democracy. And it is part of the strength of a government to be able to cope with these kind of adversarial situations and move on. And I think they will do that, because all the signs show that their compromise has been affected already. But always this kind of discussion will be there, and as he has said, development should never be a political issue. It has to rise above this aspiration, but that depends on the Indian people, how they insist. As Dr. Sinha has just said, how will they use the funds? That's something to be watched, we don't have. That depends on the electorate also, to ensure supervision and ensure monitoring.
Okay, before we wrap up, Dr. Agarwal, what do you think are the challenges to our economic growth that lie ahead? Some of them we have discussed. Agricultural growth is one, of course.
When we look at challenges, I think it would be a little bit of a slow pace of the introduction of the reforms because of the division of the two houses. And maybe largely less of the support from the present machinery which is there because of the new machinery which might be there in terms of the government setup and all. Maybe that may be a challenge, but otherwise in terms of having a GDP growth rate projection of 8%, savings rate of about 30%, gross capital formation of about 34%, inflation rate of about 5%, export surplus, export rate change of about 4%, a negative import growth rate of about minus 8.1%. They're all positive places besides the reforms in all sectors, right from judicial, right from tapping the parallel economy to setting up the SIT, setting up the e-portal which is there, which brings about a single window framework for people to bring about an investment in this country. Irrigation projects which have been initiated in the budget, which take care of the agriculture sector, creating Jan Dhan Yojana, which is giving people who don't have bank accounts to giving them bank accounts and access to financial sector. These are all good reforms to take progress in India to a higher growth rate.
Okay, Mr. Sinha, how do you view the road ahead?
The two major challenges the economy facing at this point of time, one of course you rightly mentioned agriculture. Agriculture is actually passing through a huge crisis. I mean, to explain it what crisis probably I'll take much longer, so I'll stop here. The other is of course a revival of investment. Which is taking much longer than what one would have expected. And part of the reason of course is that if you look at more closely, then the corporate, there are 2-3 elements to that. One is that the capacity utilization in the industrial sector is stagnating around 70-72%. At that level, of course, the next cycle of investment should have taken off, but corporates are not very sure as to how the demands would pan out, so they are just not coming forward. The second is the over-leveraged balance sheet of the corporate sector, particularly of the infrastructure companies, so that's another thing. And the third thing, of course, is the public sector banks which had lent to the corporate sector, their balance sheet. So, so long as they are repairing their balance sheet.
Okay, so there are challenges ahead while basic parameters are looking up for our economy. On that note, it's time for me to wrap up this discussion here.